Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Anti-Tech Cast. I'm Griffin, and today I'm here with Sean Fleming from the University of Cambridge. How you doing, Sean? Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me, Griffin.
So we are talking to you today because you recently published an article called "The Unabomber and the Origins of Anti-Tech Radicalism," and we had this recommended to us, and we read it, and we loved it. We thought it was a really great and fair representation of these ideas and where anti-tech ideas and where they came from, especially where Kaczynski got a lot of his ideas. So it's a nice, refreshing academic piece that gives these ideas their merit and doesn't talks about Kaczynski's ideas rather than his activities that got him infamous. And so we like these articles and we want more of them. And Sean, before we kind of get into some of the things you're writing about, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you got into these ideas, how you maybe found out about Kaczynski and thought it important to analyze his ideas in this way.
Okay, well, I first read Industrial Society and Its Future, Kaczynski's manifesto, in late 2018. So for background here, I'm not American. I'm from a remote part of Canada. And so the Unabomber doesn't loom as large culturally for us. Mm-hmm. So I had heard of him, of course, as most people have, but I knew absolutely nothing about him. So I was going in blind. I actually came across Industrial Society and Its Future on a reading list for a law and technology discussion group. So
interesting. So did you even know that it was like the guy that sent the bombs that wrote this piece, or you just found the piece on its own?
I associated Theodore Kaczynski with the Unabomber. I knew that much.
Okay, yeah.
But I came across it on a reading list, and I, at the time, was working on issues having to do with responsibility for harms caused by autonomous weapons. So I was interested in what the lawyers were saying about the issues of responsibility that are posed by new technologies. Mm-hmm. So what I was working on wasn't very radical, to say the least. And so I came across the manifesto and decided to put it aside for some weekend reading. And I thought it was going to be an insane conspiratorial rant.
Right.
I was expecting something like Charles Manson. Mm-hmm. And when I read it, I was pretty floored by it. I thought to myself, well, first of all, this isn't at all conspiratorial. It's incredibly radical, but it is radically anti-conspiratorial. Mm-hmm. The whole logic of Industrial Society and Its Future is evolutionary. Mm-hmm. He sees human beings as products of evolution. He thinks we're maladapted to life in a world of concrete and steel. He thinks we're biologically and psychologically maladjusted to this kind of life. And he doesn't see technology as the product of a conspiracy. He doesn't think there's an evil cabal of technocrats plotting to enslave humanity.
Right.
He thinks that we're seduced by technology because of its benefits. So we're sleepwalking into a world where we're dominated by technology. There's no one plotting against us. And so it struck me as pretty interesting. And at the time, I hadn't read much about theories of technology. I hadn't read much in the philosophy of technology. I hadn't read Jacques Ellul or Lewis Mumford or any of those figures. So I wasn't sure how original it was, but it was pretty intriguing. I discovered that it was one of the most read political manifestos of the 20th century. And I did a quick library search to see what had been written about it. And I was shocked that hardly anything had been written about it. Mm-hmm. There's hardly any secondary literature on Industrial Society and Its Future. And so I was pretty appalled by this, actually. Yeah. It seemed like my profession of political theory had abdicated its role of analyzing the salient political manifestos and documents and ideologies of our time.
Why would you say that people were so hesitant to write about it? What would account, do you think, for this absence of secondary literature?
Good question. maybe I should piggyback on someone else. So Michael Mello, he's a former law professor at Vermont, had corresponded quite a lot with Kaczynski, given him legal advice. He's probably he died a few years ago, but he was the undisputed expert on Kaczynski's legal case.
Mm-hmm.
And he always said that Kaczynski was ignored and portrayed as insane at his trial because he profaned everything that modern society holds divine.
Mm-hmm.
He was too radical for us to contemplate. So we had no choice but to dismiss him as a madman. So maybe that's it. It can't be that he used violence. The violence alone doesn't explain why people are so terrified of Kaczynski. If you look at other figures who are violent radicals, think of we teach Lenin in political theory courses. We teach Antonio Negri, who did time in prison in Italy, and who's still a darling of the left.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe academics detest Kaczynski precisely because he hates the left. I think that's part of it. But
there's like a lot of leftists in academia, so they're kind of immediately taken, or they don't want to engage with it.
I think that's it. And I also think there's a deep pathology in the discipline of political theory at work here. Mm-hmm. So political theorists tend to latch on to figures that they like.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, if you see someone working on the thought of someone, whether it's Hannah Arendt or Thomas Hobbes or John Locke or Friedrich Hayek or Rousseau or whoever it is, you can be pretty sure that that person is sympathetic to the thinker that they're analyzing.
Right.
So it often seems like a game where people are using historical political thinkers as as puppets in their own little intellectual battles. And I think that's what's really unhealthy about the discipline of political theory. Why are people so unwilling to engage seriously with thinkers that they detest?
Yeah.
Or thinkers that they find troubling.
Yeah, that seems like antithetical to getting to the truth of matters, political matters and otherwise, right?
Yeah. So in short, to answer the original question, I started working on this because I've never seen such a glaring gap in the literature, so to speak. Mm-hmm. This was one of the most famous manifestos of the 20th century, and hardly anyone had written about it. And second, I discovered that there was a massive trove of material at the University of Michigan, at the Labadie collection, that includes copies of most of the material that the FBI confiscated from Kaczynski's cabin back in April 1996. Mm-hmm. And hardly anyone had used this for academic purposes. It's one of the most popular collections at Michigan's library. But no one had used it to write this intellectual history, to figure out where his ideas came from.
Would you say that even, because in the first part of your article, you talk about some academics that have attempted to provide some kind of intellectual history for Kaczynski. And do you think these people as well were also somehow they didn't access that treasure trove in Ann Arbor either, or they weren't accessing it properly? Do you think that's the case?
Well, when most of the attempts to analyze the manifesto were written, the archive at Michigan wasn't available. So some of them can't be faulted because, well, they didn't have access to what I had access to.
Right.
So much of the early work, there are a few sources. There's an article by Tim Luke in Telos called Rereading the Unabomber Manifesto. Mm-hmm. That's from 1996, 1997. So that's really the first academic attempt to analyze the manifesto. And Luke was working with no primary material whatsoever. He was just reading the manifesto and trying to figure out where the ideas came from that way.
Gotcha.
Then there was much better article by Scott Corey, who was at the time a PhD student at Berkeley. And Corey's article is better simply because he had access to a lot more material. So he used a lot of the legal documents that he could get his hands on.
Mhm.
He was one of the few people without a press pass who actually attended Kaczynski's trial. So it's a pretty good article, but he doesn't have access to all the correspondence and all the stuff that the FBI dug out of boxes in Kaczynski's cabin,
Mhm.
his drafts and notes and all this sort of stuff. And then there's the most popular account of his intellectual influences, which comes from a book called Harvard and the Unabomber by Alston Chase. And there, as far as I can tell, Chase just wildly speculates about Kaczynski's influences with hardly any evidence whatsoever.
Mhm.
And so some of the early accounts of his influences can't be faulted. Some of them, I think, are just so stories that, well, make pretty sweeping claims about where his ideas came from without any evidence.
Right. We read the manifesto, and this idea sounds like this idea. So we're just going to tie this huge collection of authors to him, like that list that you mentioned of all the authors that he supposedly read or that they claimed that he was inspired from, and then he hadn't even read a lot, like most of them that were on that list. It's yeah, it seems kind of evident that they were just kind of throwing out whoever sounded similar, right?
That's right. And even the similarities are pretty tenuous.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chase says, well, Kaczynski sounds a bit like E.F. Schumacher. He sounds a bit like Lewis Mumford. Sounds a bit like Arendt. There's a bit of Aristotle in there, he thinks. Eric Fromm, the list goes on.
Mm-hmm.
Tim Luke says he sounds a bit like Marcuse. Lots of people have said he sounds like Paul Goodman. It turns out that he had actually read very few of them.
Mm-hmm.
And most of these figures, if he had read them, he read them only after he wrote the manifesto. So what's remarkable about him is actually not how similar he is to previous critics of technology, but how little he knows or cares about them.
Yeah.
There's really only one prominent critic of technology in the 20th century that he knew or cared much about, and that was Jacques Ellul.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about how he was inspired by Ellul's ideas and how they connect to each other?
So most of what Kaczynski borrowed from Ellul comes from Ellul's 1954 book, La Technique, which was translated into English in 1964 and published as The Technological Society. There are several ideas that Kaczynski takes from Ellul. One is that human beings are maladapted to life in a technological society. I discussed that at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
The basic idea is that human beings evolved in a primitive Stone Age environment. We're still genetically hunter-gatherers, but now we've been thrust into this world of concrete and steel, and we're psychologically ill-equipped to deal with that.
Genetics don't evolve that quickly.
Well, yeah, that's right. And so that is one idea. Now, it's notable, though, that for Ellul, the mismatch between human beings and the technological society was more social than biological. Ellul thought that the problem was that our norms and morals and social structures and communities can't evolve fast enough to keep up with technology. Whereas Kaczynski wasn't concerned so much about those things. He was concerned about our biology. Mm-hmm. So already there, they diverge. But the basic idea that we're maladapted or maladjusted to technology comes from Ellul. The second idea is the idea that technology is autonomous, that it is a force beyond human control. It can't be subject to rational human control, that technology constitutes a self-perpetuating system. This also comes from Ellul. This is probably Ellul's most famous idea, and it's papered all over Kaczynski's writings. Mm-hmm. There are also lots of little bits and pieces. So There's the idea that technology is the opposite of nature. That also comes from Ellul. The idea that, well, in part, the idea of revolution comes from Ellul, though Kaczynski takes it in his own direction. And the least obvious thing that comes from Ellul is the idea that leftism is a form of pseudo-revolution. So this is one of the big arguments in industrial society and its future. And the one I think that has puzzled readers the most. So you open up industrial society and its future, and he starts talking about technology and what it's done to us. And then in the very first main section, he talks about leftism. He talks about how the left is psychologically perverted. And he says that the left essentially co-opts the revolutionary impulse and channels it into benign outlets that are harmless to the system. So he sees social activism as, in Ellul's terms, a form of useless revolt. It makes us feel better, but it doesn't really do anything.
It's a surrogate activity, right?
That's right. So the surrogate activity, that idea comes from elsewhere, but the basic idea that the left pulls the teeth of revolutionary impulses, domesticates them, creates a kind of surrogate revolution, that it hijacks the revolutionary impulse and, well, distracts attention from the problem of technology. That comes from the end of the technological society by Ellul. So from Ellul, just to recap, we have the idea that human beings are maladapted to a technological society, the idea that technology is autonomous, and the idea that social activism, that the social movements of our time are pseudo-revolutionary. That's mainly what Kaczynski takes from Ellul.
Gotcha. And I guess I would ask then, how does he diverge from Ellul a little bit? Like, I guess specifically, I guess first, I guess we could specifically talk about like more of those nuanced differences between like his evolutionary and biological focus versus Ellul's social economic focus. Like, how do these approaches differ in your eyes? Or like,
okay, well, yeah, maybe the biggest, deepest difference of all, before we get on to the specific difference, specific set of differences, is that Ellul is a fundamentally continental thinker. So he's very French. His dialectical approach, his kind of meandering, free-flowing style is quintessentially French and heavily influenced by Marx. So whenever Ellul is saying something, there's always an antithesis to whatever he's saying. So the thesis that technology is hemming us in on all sides, that it's depriving us completely of freedom, is one side of a dialectic. So the other side he gives you in a later book called The Ethics of Freedom, which basically says that although technology has deprived us almost entirely of freedom, we can still find freedom in Jesus Christ. He's a fundamentally Christian thinker. So he's a dialectical theologian, is one way of putting it. And that is not at all what Kaczynski is. Kaczynski essentially lopped off the theological part and the dialectical part. So Kaczynski writes like an analytic philosopher. He, well, numbered paragraphs. That says it all.
Yeah, very
his
structured.
His style is radically different because his method and his worldview are radically different. So Ellul is trying to mount a kind of theological critique of technology. And Kaczynski, although he abhors what science has created, he accepts the scientific worldview. So he understands human beings and technology alike as products of evolutionary processes. And he speaks the language of behavioral and cognitive psychology. Even his bombs, he documented the results in an extensive set of lab notes. So although he although he detests science and technology at one level, he accepts the worldview of the scientist or the technician. And
Do you
Ellul
find that
doesn't.
to be a bit ironic considering his stance on those things?
Well, you can read it in two ways. You can read it as blatant hypocrisy,
Mm-hmm.
which is how some have read it. You know, Ron Arnold is one who wrote this book, Eco Terror, back in I guess it was 1977. He tried to associate Kaczynski with the radical environmental movement.
Mm.
And one of his claims is that Kaczynski is blatantly hypocritical, using technology to attack technology and using technology to propagate anti-tech ideas is inherently hypocritical. You know, others who've criticized him along these lines are people like Kevin Kelly, the co-founder of Wired, who's well aware of Kaczynski's ideas and actually accepts quite a lot of them, especially the idea that technology is a self-organizing system, but diverges from him on the obvious point of whether technology is good.
Yeah.
And so Kelly says the same. He says, look, Kaczynski was living off the fat of the technological system. He was a blatant hypocrite. Now, the other way of reading Kaczynski is that his critique of technology was an internal criticism. He understands himself as a product of the technological system. He's trying to attack it from the inside. And so, whereas Ellul tries to set up an alternative vantage point, an external vantage point, a non-technical vantage point from which to criticize the technological society, Kaczynski tries to mount his critique from the inside, from inside the worldview of the technician. And so Kaczynski might retort to the charge of hypocrisy. He might say, well, if my critique succeeds, it's all the more damning, because I've shown that even from the scientist's or the technician's own premises, the technological system is fundamentally flawed and beyond redemption. So this is what he's trying to do. He's trying to mount an internal critique of modern technology.
That makes sense. I think that's kind of something similar to what we're doing. You know, we get a lot of charges of like, oh, you guys are anti-tech, but you have a website and a podcast and you're like doing all those things. Well, you know, the idea is to attack it from the inside, and that, you know, we have to recognize that we're a product of it. Yeah, in the same way. And hopefully that will make the argument even stronger. I guess on the other side of that coin, would you say, or do you think that maybe Ellul was, I don't want to say naive, but like, that he was missing something when he was trying to take that external stance? Do you think he was failing to recognize how he was a product of the technical system? Or I don't know, do you think there's another side of the coin there?
I think he recognized that he was a product of the technological system. One of the things that he takes from Hegel and repeats endlessly is the idea that the first act of freedom is a recognition of necessity. You have to recognize that you are constrained and under the power of the system in order to have any possibility of resisting it. Ellul is not someone who has any illusions there, but you might think that his critique of technology is less persuasive because it comes from the outside. Now, Ellul would retort that it's actually Kaczynski who is, well, off the rails here. So one of the things he says in his 1988 book, The Technological Bluff, is that technical thinking is incapable of thinking about technique. It's not possible, in Ellul's view, to mount a critique of technoscience from within the technological worldview. So the argument here is something like this. As soon as you try to use technoscience, as soon as you adopt the calculating strategic language of technoscience, you are reinforcing it. So for Ellul, technique is a mindset. It's not just a system that's external to us. The reason that the technological system persists is that we all think in technical terms.
Mhm.
So Marcuse makes a similar point later on. He says, well, what sustains this system? Well, one-dimensional modes of discourse that give priority to a certain kind of rationality and efficiency over everything else. So for Ellul, it's necessary to break the habits of mind that sustain technology in order to really defeat it. And so he would argue against Kaczynski that Kaczynski is simply reinforcing the technological mindset. He's not fundamentally challenging anything in Ellul's view.
Would you say Ellul then also would disagree with the idea of using technology in any way? That's the same thing for him, right? Is like using technology and having that technical mindset. Like, do you think there's any way for Ellul to agree with the idea that you could use technology in a way that takes down the system a little bit, as Kaczynski seems to think we can do? Or does he think that as soon as you start using it, you're supporting it? Like, you have to be completely external from it. Is that kind of where he's coming from, do you think?
I don't think he thinks you can use technology against itself.
Mhm.
I think his view is that when you use technology, you're making a sort of deal with the devil.
Right.
He doesn't think power can be turned against power. His fundamental commitment here is that no one can really control power at any fundamental level.
Mhm.
So just as he thinks, that violence cannot overthrow a power structure and replace violence with non-violence, just as violence can't be overturned violently, he doesn't think technology can be overturned technologically.
Interesting. So I guess that's a good segue into like, what do you can you say a little bit about what Ellul's perspective on how to revolt against the system, like, or maybe the differences between Ellul and Kaczynski's approach to how to, either weaken the system or take it down or revolt against it in some way? How do their approaches differ?
All right, so Kaczynski's approach is, I suppose, an empirical approach to revolution. So Kaczynski thinks that you can look back through the history of revolution and distill lessons for an anti-tech revolution in the present.
Mm-hmm.
So he says we can look at the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and the Irish Revolution and a whole host of other revolutions, and we can discern some rough guidelines and some pitfalls to avoid for the anti-tech revolution. Mm-hmm. So fundamentally for him, the anti-tech revolution is modeled on historical revolution. And despite what he says in Industrial Society and Its Future, he's pretty confident that it's going to be a violent revolution. Mm-hmm. He doesn't think the technological system can be overthrown without force. And although he's ambivalent about violence in the manifesto, he says in this unpublished essay called In Defense of Violence, which is in the Labadie archive, that the revolution he envisions is almost certainly going to be violent. He says he downplayed the role of violence in the manifesto simply because he didn't think the media would publish anything that explicitly advocated violence. So that is Kaczynski's revolution. It's a violent overthrow of the established power structure. It's a destruction not only of the state, but of the broader infrastructure that sustains the technological system. And you can get a better idea of what he means here, what the beginnings of this revolution might look like, which is really large-scale industrial sabotage, from his essay, Hit Where It Hurts. So that's Kaczynski's revolution. It's violent and it's based on historical examples. Ellul's revolution is exactly the opposite. So Kaczynski read Ellul's book, Autopsy of Revolution, when he was in Montana, but completely ignored or missed the point. So one of Ellul's central points in this book is that an anti-tech revolution can't possibly be modeled on historical revolutions. And there are a few reasons for that, but one of the main ones is that technology is too global and too pervasive to be overthrown like a government. He thinks it's a huge mistake to extrapolate from historical examples of revolution. And he thinks that the kind of strategic, calculating thought about revolution, which you'll find in Kaczynski's book, Anti-Tech Revolution, is exactly the kind of thought that will simply reinforce technique as a mindset. So Ellul doesn't give you a handbook for revolution here, and he's using revolution in a pretty odd sounding way. But there's one little snippet from Autopsy of Revolution near the very end that I think captures what he means by revolution. So he says, I'll paraphrase here. He says, it would represent a fundamental breach in the technological society, a truly revolutionary attitude, if contemplation could replace frantic activity. So Ellul's revolution doesn't involve overthrowing anything by force. It involves deliberately slowing down and rejecting the sort of arms race in which we find ourselves in modern society.
So just kind of not engaging with it, just backing off, right? And
well, it's not total divestment from it either. I don't think Ellul thinks we can run to the woods and escape from it in any fundamental way. But what he thinks is that we can deliberately slow down in defiance of the system. And if enough people do that, if enough people refuse to think and live in a technical way, concerned with means over ends, with efficiency over all else, then the system will inevitably break down.
Do you find that to be a bit ideological, or do you think that's actually like practically realistic in some future? Or idyllic, sorry.
I'm not optimistic. I'm not optimistic about the possibility of doing that. But it sounds to me kind of like what Gandhi says about how the Indians should deliberately withdraw consent from the British Empire. So for Gandhi, the way of getting rid of the British was not to drive them out with force, but to refuse to participate in their industrial civilization, to put the mind over the body. And that is essentially Ellul's idea of what resistance against technology looks like. Slow down is really the message.
One thing that I like about your article is that you don't shy away from talking about the violence aspect, especially in relation to like more modern movements like ITS and things like that seem to be continuing these violent tendencies. One thing that got me thinking is you mentioned that ITS kind of has this idea that violence is innate to human nature, kind of, and so like that's kind of their way of revolting against the system that's in place, the nonviolent system that's in place, is to embrace our humanity through violence, kind of, or at least that's how I'm interpreting their position. And I guess it makes me think a little bit about like, just I think it's very questionable what our natural tendencies are as humans. And one thing that I think of about when I think about Ellul is his idea. I was wondering if you could clarify for me then, does Ellul have this idea that humans have an innate tendency to think about things in a technological way, or to engage in like rational technique? Am I wrong about that, or doesn't he kind of say that we have a tendency to rationalize the world in that way?
Okay, well, I don't think Ellul has any fixed concept of human nature. This is one fundamental difference between Kaczynski and Ellul. So again, for Ellul, the problem with technology is that it has outstripped the evolution of our social structures and communities and norms. You know, the mismatch between us and technology is sociological rather than biological.
Right.
It's not based on human nature. And I think, judging by the first part of the technological society, Ellul thinks that in the past we were perfectly capable of resisting the pull of technique. So he talks about several different societies that resisted the urge to prioritize means over ends. So first he says, look at the ancient Greeks. So the ancient Greeks were incredibly sophisticated philosophically and scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
But he claims they had contempt for practical application. They could have used their knowledge to manipulate the world, but they didn't. They wanted to understand it. So he says, for the Greeks, there was a stark division between science, understanding of the world, and technique, application. And then he says, you can see this later on in Christian societies, you know, from the Roman Empire to the, I don't remember whether he says the 12th or 14th century. He says, in Christian society, early Christian society, or even up through the Middle Ages, Christianity posed a difficult barrier to the expansion of technique. Mm-hmm. So Christianity was the sort of sand in the gears of the machine. Nothing could be developed without moral criticism. So early Christianity created this kind of external vantage point from which to criticize technique. So it was a constant source of judgment that technique couldn't overcome. So for Ellul, it's not human nature that's decisive. It's culture that's decisive.
That's interesting, especially considering, like, you know, I think a lot about how the tech society that we live in today is very, at least the way I experience it through the internet and stuff, it's very vehemently secular, that it there's like a rise in atheism with an embrace that comes with an embrace of science and technology, because I think, you know, there's that recognition that it halts progress, so to speak. And so I guess, yeah, is that what we're kind of missing today? We're missing a moral barrier between that should be there for progress.
Well, Ellul would say, actually, we don't live in a secular age. We have simply abandoned the old religions
And adopted the
and
new ones.
Created a new one. Mm-hmm. We've created, well, Kaczynski calls it technianity, analogous to Christianity. Ellul calls it, I think, technolatry, as in idolatry. Mm. And so he says, first, we abandoned religions of nature. We abandoned spiritual views of nature in favor of, you know, Abrahamic religions. Mm-hmm. And then we chased religious significance out of all the things we used to attach it to and projected it onto the objects that we now revere. So the computer is a religious symbol in our time. Mm-hmm. It's almost sacrilegious, blasphemous even, to smash one, or to damn one, just or even have contempt for one. And so Ellul thinks that it's not that we lack religion, it's that we've abandoned the old religions that grew up organically and now adhere to a kind of industrial technological religion, which, well, essentially deifies means and has contempt for ends.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Yeah. I guess I also want to ask too. there's these two approaches that Ellul Kaczynski seem to have. It's kind of like, so Ellul's is to, focus on contemplation rather than practicality, right? Kind of getting back to that Greek mindset, so to speak. And then Kaczynski thinks that we need to take a more practical approach, that we need to use technology in order to take it down, that we need to take the system down before it just harms us even further or turns us into slaves or brings us into a dystopia where it will be too late to do anything about anything. I, I guess, one thing that we've been learning about a little bit recently as a group is this concept of accelerationism, which may or may not be a consequence or be derived from like Marxist philosophy. I can't say for certain, but I don't know. Do you have you thought much about accelerationism and how it connects this stuff? And like, I don't know. I wonder if you could enlighten me a little bit on how that approach might relate to these guys.
All right, there's lots to say about accelerationism.
Mhm.
So accelerationism in its contemporary trendy form comes from what I know, one main source, and that is the British philosopher Nick Land.
Yes.
So he's a kind of reactionary who is incredibly optimistic about technology. I don't really understand what Land is about and haven't read enough of him to comment much on him. But he seems to be the inspiration for, directly or indirectly, for most of the contemporary forms of accelerationism. So you can divide accelerationists into really two camps. You have the ones like Land, who are socially reactionaries. They want some sort of hierarchical, even neo-Catholic society, but at the same time are optimistic about the prospects that technology could liberate us from labor, for example. And then you have left accelerationists who think that capitalism is actually holding back technological progress. It's a hindrance to what technology could do if it were unleashed from the constraints of things like economic viability. So the left accelerationist wants to unleash the potential of technology to liberate humanity. And in order to do that, thinks that we have to accelerate past capitalism. But they have a common root in Nick Land, who is decidedly on the right. Now, I think accelerationist ideas go back much further than that. So one source is Herbert Marcuse. So Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man is one of the most famous books that mounts what's often thought to be a critique of technology. And so much as Ellul did before him, he argues that the problem with modern society is that we have what he calls a one-dimensional universe of discourse that assigns priority to specific kinds of rationality and efficiency. It's a society of means over ends, to use Ellul's kind of terminology. And so Marcuse is a critic of this kind of technological society. But at the very end of the book, he says, well, if only we could think about technology in the right way, if only we could escape the constraints of this one-dimensional discourse, if only we could set up some, negative or two-dimensional or normative discourse that we could use to direct technology, then it could liberate us from toil. He appears to be a radical critic of technology if you read only some parts of the book. But once you get to the end, you see that he's actually a radical optimist about technology. So Marcuse, I think, is often wrongly placed on the critical side of the technological ledger. So those are a few thoughts about accelerationism and where it comes from. I think of course, it's also there in a nascent form in Marx himself. The the idea that technology is a force for liberation is certainly there in Marx.
But I think as as Ellul seems to talk about in Technique and State, that Marx is a little naive about his approach, and that they're that like capitalism and socialism, as he understands it, are both technological systems in the way that they were approaching it. Is that right?
Yeah, so Ellul says it doesn't matter who controls the means of production. That's not the central issue. So Ellul says, and he looked at both sides of the Cold War and saw basically the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So he looked at the US and its assembly lines and its consumerism and its bureaucracies. And he looked at the Soviet Union and said, well, maybe you have less consumerism, but you still have the assembly lines and the bureaucracies.
Mm-hmm.
These are both technological societies. The differences in ideology and economic doctrine are not as significant as they seem. So Ellul was decidedly less optimistic about the possibility of accelerating past our current circumstance.
So, like, as far as thanks for that clarification. As far as accelerationism goes, I guess you've enlightened me a little bit, because I've heard about it a lot in the context of like an approach, for an anti-tech approach that's possible, an accelerationist approach that I think it, from what I've heard, it takes this idea that Kaczynski mentions of, and I guess I don't know if Ellul mentions it, of like the inevitable collapse of the system, that it's kind of driving itself downward even without us trying to. And so like it's our, job as revolutionaries to, wait until it's weak enough to strike that final blow, kind of. And so, like, I guess I've heard of that there are some people that take this like accelerationist approach where they see that there's inevitable collapse and they try to they want to drive the system to collapse faster by supporting it, I guess. I don't know. Have you heard about this kind of approach, or am I just like off base on what accelerationism is?
No, I think that is accelerationist.
Okay.
In some sense. And I think it's already there in industrial society and its future. So there is a passage where Kaczynski says that the anti-tech movement should be in favor of trade agreements. So he says we should support whatever he's talking about, the World Trade Organization or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, because in order to bring down the system in one fell swoop, you have to tightly integrate the system, make sure it's stitched together. So the problem with the system as he saw it then was that it wasn't tightly coupled enough, as he says in Anti-Tech Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
When you stitch it together, when you make all the parts dependent on all the others, as you do through trade, then it becomes easier to make the whole thing collapse at once. Mm-hmm. So there he is putting forth a very accelerationist idea that in order to bring about the collapse, you have to bring about the development of the system.
Right. Or bring about those developments that will lead to like a weakening of the system, or making it more vulnerable, so to speak.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And this idea, now that I think on it, is, well, it's not quite there in the same prescriptive form in Ellul, but the idea that the development of the system makes it more fragile is definitely there in Ellul.
Yeah, with his idea of monism, right?
That's right. Yeah, monism is definitely there. Yeah, but in his later book, The Technological Bluff, his 1988 book, there's a section near the end about fragility and how the development of the system appears to make the system stronger, but actually makes it more fragile. And there's a part that, seems to anticipate Kaczynski's hit where it hurts, where he says, well, look at all these power lines. The more of them there are, the more of these high tension wires there are, the more things there are to attack. We'd be fools to think that someone won't eventually try to attack them. And so Ellul is well aware of this, but Ellul doesn't write in the same prescriptive way, and he doesn't tell us that we should go out there and attack the system.
Right.
It's not Ellul's game at all.
I guess you kind of talking about this monistic quality of technology and tying it together to weaken it. I guess it does kind of bring to light for me this possibly an issue with Kaczynski's taking his revolutionary ideas from history, because I think about it like the French Revolution and the all the historical revolutions that he's drawing from. These were revolutions against human systems that I guess I don't think there is a case of a global uh, network that is trying to be revolted against. Like, um, it seems that in order to fight against a global system like Kaczynski wants to, you need to have uh, a global revolution, right? And but I don't know, how does this how would that uh, gel with his idea that, oh, the revolution has to be like a small minority group, right? That is strongly focused and able to efficiently like get things done. Have you thought about this earlier? Like, I don't know. Do you side with Ellul or Kaczynski on that idea of like drawing from history in order to figure out what to do now?
Well, let me take the second point first.
Hmm.
So I think what Kaczynski has in mind is a set of attacks on central pieces of infrastructure where breaking down one part will inevitably break down the rest. So think about the global payment system.
Hmm.
If you can take out a particular node in some networks that happens to be located in the United States or Europe, you could potentially cause havoc globally. So he thinks that the system is coupled together enough that if you attack one part of it, the dominoes will fall. And this is, I think, how he reconciles his claim that the revolution has to be led by a small group of people with his claim that it has to be global. He thinks that it hit where it hurts, again, is the decisive essay here.
Hmm.
This helps to explain what he's on about. So on the question of whether the anti-tech revolution can be modeled on history, well, I think Ellul completely preempted Kaczynski's argument here. So Ellul seemed to anticipate that someone like Kaczynski would eventually come along and read the technological society and then think that a violent revolution was the answer. And the purpose of Autopsy of Revolution is exactly to say that this kind of revolution is dead. It doesn't work anymore. And he says, whether you're talking about the French or the Russian Revolution or any of the later revolutions, these are all essentially the same kind of revolution. These all follow the same model of revolution, which is based on Marx's extrapolation from the French Revolution.
Hmm.
This is a historically specific idea of revolution that just doesn't travel, is what he's trying to say. And so whether you're talking about a revolution against technology or a revolution against a government, Ellul just doesn't think it works the same way anymore.
Why,
And
why, why specifically does it not work anymore?
well, the system is, well, let's take why doesn't it work against technology first, and then why doesn't it work against a particular government? So it doesn't work against technology because technology depends on modes of thought, a mindset. This is the point I mentioned before, that you can overthrow a group of people violently on the model of the French or Russian revolutions, but you can't overthrow a system of thought. Violence can change governments, but it can't change minds.
Yeah.
That's essentially what he has in mind. And he thinks that even for overthrowing governments, the old model doesn't really apply. At that point is admittedly a little more opaque. But the idea seems to be that a true revolution has to cut against the tide of history. So history has a certain direction to it. You can predict what, with some accuracy, what, all of the things being equal, the first or the next 20 or 30 years will bring. You can imagine what it would be like for our society to develop in this direction over another 20 years. And he says, a real revolution cuts against the tide of history. So this is what makes it revolutionary rather than just reformist or an acceleration toward the same. And he says, what's peculiar about the French Revolution is that it pushes with the tide of history. So it was pushing in the direction of power. So the monarchy and the aristocracy were losing ground economically to new landholders and new economic interests in France. And all the revolution did was push in the direction that the economic forces were already pushing, which was against the monarchy, against the old feudal power structures. So Marx's mistake, Ellul thinks, is to think, first of all, that revolutions have to be class-based. And second of all, that they push in the direction of history. So, in Marxist thought, revolutions are, well, the locomotive of history is the kind of catchphrase. So Ellul doesn't think any true revolution in our world can take the model of the French or Russian revolutions, because a true revolution has to cut against the probable course of history. That seems to be what makes a revolution in the first place.
That's just less possible now to cut against it.
Well, I think the question for Ellul is how to cut against it. And the way to cut against it is certainly not to be strategic and calculating. The way to cut against it is not to develop a revolutionary doctrine and refine revolutionary tactics. That's just to reinforce technique for Ellul. The way to cut against it, the way to defy the course of history, the way to have any real freedom, is to reject the habits of thought and of action that have been instilled in us, to act in a deliberately non-technical, inefficient, contemplative way.
I guess I want to ask you, where do you see any kind of like hope for that method of getting rid of the system, or do you think that we're just getting deeper and deeper sucked into it? Like, I guess for the next generation of people, do you see any kind of hope there, or any kind of, at least in terms of how people are thinking about technology? Because I don't know, I feel like I see a little bit, we've noticed a resurgence of Kaczynski in popular culture now. We have like these Netflix documentaries and stuff, and people seem to be, whether it was like a result of the pandemic or just life in general, it seems like some people, or at least more people, are getting disillusioned with the system. But even some of those people are, I guess, not really focusing on the right things that are wrong with society right now. A lot of people are focused on like human rights issues and things like that, and not seeing how a lot of these social issues that we face now are kind of a result of the technological issues that we're facing. So I guess, I don't know, what do you have hope for the future, or do you think that we're just getting further sucked in? What do you think?
Well, I think you're right that a lot more people are interested in the problem of technology. And you see a lot of discussion about critics of technology nowadays. The one who is, I think, most trendy right now, and more than trendy, I think there's a really deep engagement with him, is Ivan Illich, if you're familiar with him.
Yeah.
So Illich is someone who was pretty heavily influenced by Ellul, and he's having his day in the sun now because he seems so much more prophetic in retrospect.
Mhm.
So I think there are reasons for hope. And I'm not sure that I'd say all is lost.
Mhm.
Uh, it's a good question.
Yeah, it's hard. You know, we like to think that hope is not lost. That it seems that a lot of people that are even aware of these ideas or are willing to engage with engaged in the discussion uh, are kind of nihilistic about the whole thing. Like they notice all of the issues that we're facing, how a lot of these result from the type of society that we've created and all the technology that we embrace day to day, and that we now, these are our new. This is the new church, kind of, and we attend mass every waking hour, and so yeah, we want to try to fight against that nihilism, but it's hard when even like the people that are most vehemently against it disagree about what to actually do about it and what the best course of action is. And so a lot of people, I guess, get this they descend into nihilism where they think, well, there's nothing that I can do about it, so I'll just submit myself in lieu of better options. I guess.
Yeah, I suppose there are two forms of, well, maybe we can distinguish here between nihilism and fatalism.
Yes.
What you're describing seems to be the fatalistic response.
Right.
We can't do anything about the system, so let's just live our lives.
Mm-hmm.
So you recognize all the problems and then you just go watch some Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think, a pretty common response. The less common one, maybe more worrying response, is ITS.
Yeah.
I discuss ITS, the Mexican terrorist group, in my article. And ITS is heavily inspired by Kaczynski, but differs in one absolutely crucial respect. So Kaczynski still has hope. Kaczynski is actually a surprisingly optimistic thinker in the end.
Mm-hmm.
He's an incredibly brutal thinker, but he still has hope that the technological system can be overthrown and that humanity can regain its ground.
Yeah, he values human dignity and human freedom. He loves humanity, so to speak. Like,
well, that's what's remarkable about him. He actually does, at some level, love humanity of a particular kind.
Yeah.
Now, he doesn't love people he thinks have given up their humanity by becoming cogs in the technological system. He thinks that they're legitimate targets for violence as soon as they've given up their wild nature and gone into some technical profession. So he thinks that the dignity of the human being is revocable, but it's nevertheless there to start with. Now, ITS doesn't think revolution is possible. So ITS says in response to Kaczynski, that revolution itself is a leftist concept. So ITS says Kaczynski was right in his critique of leftism. So he's right that leftist social activism is a distraction from the problem of technology. It's just a palliative. It makes people feel better, but it doesn't actually do anything. So ITS accepts that, but goes one step further and says, well, the French Revolution is the model for Kaczynski's revolution. Mm-hmm. And that idea of revolution is thoroughly leftist. So ITS says to Kaczynski, you're a leftist. Kaczynski's response is, well, if you're in nothing but despair, if you don't think anything can be done about the technological system, if you're willing to throw up your hands and have this fatalistic or worse, nihilistic attitude, which says that all we can do is use violence to strike against the system, like wild animals striking back against the predator, then you're the leftists. So he says, one of the salient psychological features of leftists is feelings of inferiority, a sense of powerlessness, a sense of defeatism. And he says, that's ITS. They're the most defeatist of all. So they abandon the concept of revolution, and he is absolutely unwilling to do that. That is the essential difference between him and ITS.
I don't really, personally, I don't know a whole lot about ITS apart from what I've read about in your article. What is their like goal? Like, do they have a goal, or do they just totally like the revolution is impossible, the system's killing everyone, we're just gonna lash out? Like, do they have an objective in mind, or what do you think?
Well, they don't have a strategic goal or an ultimate end.
Right.
The purpose of their violence is essentially liberation. So they subscribe to the idea of violence as liberation that you see in, various thinkers like J.P. Sartre or Frantz Fanon. The idea that violence reaffirms our humanity.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a means to an end. It's almost an end in itself. And so the ITS's idea is that, and this part's taken from Kaczynski, that human beings are wild by nature, or violent by nature, that wild human nature is violent, that hunter-gatherer societies are not peaceful. They are, well, collections of little warlike tribes. And so one way to cast off the shackles of socialization and civilization, the ultimate form of defiance against it, is to break the fundamental norm against violence. That's the way to reclaim your wildness. That's the way you can be a wild human being, even in the midst of a technological society. And so Kaczynski agrees that human beings are wild by nature, but he sees the purpose of violence as fundamentally different. He doesn't think violence is inherently liberating. That's not the point for him. Violence has to be used strategically to overthrow the system. For ITS, violence has a personal, psychological, liberating function.
Would you say, but for Kaczynski, the violence is more, at least in the natural state, violence is for, it's used in the means of fulfilling the power process. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So violence against a deer to kill it, violence against someone who attacks you, violence against, for that matter, someone who has food that you need.
Yeah. But not just violence for violence sake, for the sake of, like, violence isn't the thing that gets you that feeling of freedom, I guess. It's fulfilling the power process as a whole, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. So who do you think is the leftist here between ITS and Kaczynski in the social debate?
I don't think I don't think I'm well placed to adjudicate this dispute. I just think it's an interesting dispute.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is going to be an important fault line in the anti-tech movement in years to come. I think the fault line between ITS and Kaczynski about whether the technological system can be really overthrown or whether personal liberation is really the goal, that is a crucial fault line. The other crucial fault line is between Kaczynski and Ellul about whether the technological system as a material apparatus is the thing that we're trying to overthrow, or whether technique as a mindset is really the target of the revolution.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that's a debate, that debate between, is it this external system thing, or is it the way that we're thinking about the world and engaging with it, and what's the real enemy? I think that's something that I struggle with a lot, and that we as groups struggle with. And I think one of the worries that I have about taking this external system approach, that's the thing that we're attacking, is that I worry that if we overlook some of the psychological aspects and like the the mindset that Ellul is talking about, if we overlook that too much, then if we do end up like succeeding and taking down the system, and then yay, we're in a post-technological society, if we don't have the right mindset established at that point, or at least the right kind of culture in place, then in my eyes, nothing's going to stop the system from just growing again and coming back. I don't know. It seems I feel more sympathetic towards Ellul's perspective, because I think that, you know, we act based on what we believe, and if we believe or if we think in a certain way, that's going to reflect in our treatment of the external world. Um and so yeah, I think that that's, I don't know, do you have a position or idea, or like what do you think is most important? Which between Kaczynski and Ellul do you think you are more sympathetic to?
Well, I'm not sure I'm sympathetic to either here, but
Mhm.
uh, I think the crux of the disagreement comes down to the old debate between idealists and materialists.
Yeah.
So this is an old social scientific debate that is crucial here. So in this way, Kaczynski is more of a Marxist than Ellul is.
Hmm.
So Kaczynski thinks that material factors ultimately drive the course of history. Ellul thinks that ideational factors, ideas, are in some cases decisive. So he thinks that, well, as I said before, that the Greek division between science and technique was a decisive barrier against the development of technology, and later that Christianity was a decisive barrier against the development of technology. In both of those cases, Ellul is relying on an idea or a set of ideas to explain the course of history. And
Hmm.
Kaczynski, I think, is a materialist. That's yet another fundamental difference between them.
Yeah. I guess another thing I wanted to ask you about then um, is in relation to the power process as Kaczynski develops the 4 steps. So you mentioned that, you know, he takes you know, the basic ideas of maladaption from Ellul, and he that kind of constructs those first 2 parts of the power process, right? And then he uses other authors like Morris and Seligman. How would you pronounce that?
Seligman, yeah.
Seligman, to kind of develop the second 2, attainment and autonomy. Can you I don't know, can you talk a little bit about these other 2 authors and how they helped him develop his ideas in the end?
Okay, so let's start with what the power process is.
Okay.
Power process for Kaczynski is the process of using your own physical and mental abilities, your own physical and mental power to attain the necessities of life. That's essentially what it is.
Mhm.
So, as he puts it in kind of psychologized language, the power process has 4 parts: goal, effort, attainment of goal, and autonomy. In order to go through the power process, you have to use effort to attain a goal autonomously.
Mhm.
So the idea that human beings need goals that require effort comes from Desmond Morris in this 1969 book called The Human Zoo. This is also where the idea of the biological mismatch comes from. So just some background on Morris before I get into where the first part of the power process comes from. Morris was curator of mammals at the London Zoo in, I think, the 50s or 60s. And one of the things he noticed was that zoo animals suffer from many of the same psychological problems that human beings suffer from in modern society. So eating disorders, anxiety, depression, insomnia, tick disorders, they pull out their feathers or their fur.
Mhm.
All of these things are, well, analogous to, or precisely the same even, as problems that human beings suffer from in modern society. So Morris's central claim in this book is that the city is not an urban jungle. It's not at all like a jungle. It's actually like a zoo.
Mhm.
It's like a zoo in the sense that it requires minimal effort to attain the necessities of life. All you have to do is do a little trick once in a while, and the zookeeper will feed you.
Mhm.
So Morris says one of the problems with keeping animals in zoos is that in the wild, omnivores like raccoons, dogs, bears, animals of that sort they have a psychological need to expend effort in order to attain their goals. As he says, they have a certain need for stimulation. And so Morris puts a label on this. He says, these animals have a need for the stimulus struggle. They need to, in order to get their food or to get water or whatever, they have to expend effort in some varied and interesting way in order to get what they want. So they have a need for stimulation. And Kaczynski translates Morris's idea of the stimulus struggle into his language of goals and effort. So the first part of the power process is derived from Morris's idea of the stimulus struggle. Mm-hmm. And the second part comes from Martin Seligman, who's a famous American psychologist, who's most famous for the idea of learned helplessness. So the basic idea of learned helplessness is that when an animal is subject to stimuli that it can't escape from, when it feels like it can't control its own fate, its morale can be broken. So in Morris's famous experiment, he put a dog in a box and subjected it to shocks that it was incapable of getting away from. Mm-hmm. So he'd shock the dog over and over again, and the dog would have to sit there and take it. And then when he would give the dog an opportunity later to escape from the shocks, you know, the dog, for instance, could move to the other side of the box and get away from the shocks. You know, a little opening would be there for the dog to run away. And many of the dogs just lay down and whined. They didn't even try to get away. So when the dogs were subjected repeatedly to stimuli that were beyond their control, they became helpless. It broke their morale.
It's kind of like that fatalistic fatalistic attitude that we were talking about earlier. Would you say it's analogous to that?
So this is part of what's going on in Kaczynski's diagnosis of the pathologies of the left. Mm-hmm. So we can get onto that in a moment. But as for the second and third parts of the power process, mm-hmm. So if you fail to attain your goals repeatedly, if it seems like what you do has no effect on the desired outcomes, whether it's in, you know, studying for a class, or whether it's, you know, practicing a sport or whatever, if you put in effort and don't attain the desired result repeatedly, you start to feel helpless. You'll stop trying because it seems like the result you get is independent of the effort you put in. Right. That's the essence of helplessness. So Kaczynski says human beings don't just need goals that require effort. They don't just need what Morris calls stimulation. They need to attain their goals with a reasonable rate of success, or else they'll start to feel helpless. And in addition, they need, or at least most human beings need, some autonomy in the pursuit of goals. They need to feel like they're not just going through the motions, you know, not just following rules that someone else has set down. They also need to be able to make their own decisions about how to pursue their goals. So in short, the idea that human beings need goals that require effort comes from Morris's idea of the stimulus struggle. And the idea that human beings need to attain their goals at a reasonable rate and to pursue them autonomously. And the evidence for the influence of these two authors is, I think, one of the most interesting things in the archive. So if you read Industrial Society and Its Future, you see that it has a full slate of footnotes. So he cites lots of sources in the manifesto, but he doesn't cite his most important sources. Yeah. He doesn't cite Ellul. He doesn't cite Morris. He doesn't cite Seligman. And the reason is that he had corresponded with academics he admired while he was in Montana. He had sent letters to them in his own name. And if he had cited them, that would have left clues for the FBI. if he had cited Seligman, for example, the FBI would have gone straight to Seligman and said, have you ever received letters that looked something like this manifesto?
Mhm.
And in all probability, they would have turned up letters from Kaczynski. So he doesn't tell you where his most important ideas came from. He deliberately conceals his sources for his own protection. So one of the things I found in the archive was a secret set of footnotes to the manifesto, where he cites a whole host of sources that he concealed in the public version. And right after the section on the power process, he cites Martin Seligman's book from 1975 called Helplessness. And then when he's talking about the psychological problems that human beings suffer from in modern society, he cites Desmond Morris's The Human Zoo. And both of those sources are, ideas from both of those sources are plastered all over the manifesto. Okay. So after Ellul, Morris and Seligman are his two most important sources. And no one seems to have discovered that. You know, people were sort of aware of Ellul's influence on Kaczynski, but there was really nothing about Morris or Seligman.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's like you found this golden nugget that nobody else had discovered yet, and just like buried in the ancient footnotes at the library.
It had been sitting there for 20 years, oddly enough. And lots of people had looked at his correspondence, but no one had bothered to look at his notes on all these academic articles. Mm-hmm. The apparently dry and boring stuff is actually by far the most interesting.
Yeah, isn't that so?
There's lots of journalists who go there just to look at salacious letters, but and just make cheap news stories out of it. But no one has really used that archive for a genuine scholarly purpose.
Yeah,
and it's still a gold mine, and I encourage people to go look for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Were you able, I guess, just a practical question, did you have to go there physically to look at them, or was there some like online ability for you to check out these sources?
I did go there physically.
Okay, yeah.
So I went in 2019, and I'm glad I did, because right now there's no way I could even enter the country.
Yeah, right.
Restrictions. So yeah, I went there and I spent days and days just digging through boxes. There's about 100 file boxes of material.
Wow.
There's massive amount of material. It would take at least months to look through all the relevant material on Kaczynski.
Wow.
But it's a gold mine for historians, political theorists, anyone else, really. You know, there's so much yet to be written on this subject.
Yeah, and then I guess it's kind of the the mood towards the end of your article. It gives me the feeling of that you have the impression that and these anti-tech ideas are only going to become more prevalent. That this drama between ITS and Kaczynski's ideas are they're going to become very important as technology advances further and further. And I guess ideally people become more disillusioned and start seeing the issues and start wanting to actually address them. And so, yeah, I guess, do you see a revolution in our future, or do you think that, I don't know.
No, that is a great question.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I see a revolution, but I do see an increasingly large and formidable anti-tech movement growing up. And
right.
I think it will be less of a unified movement and more of a family of movements. Mm-hmm. So what I think is going to happen is that you'll have an increasing number of people who are opposed to modern technology in some form or another, but coming at it from different angles. You'll have lots of people who are opposed to technology for broadly green reasons. People who are opposed to technology because they think it's a disaster for the environment. Right. Then you'll have people like Kaczynski who oppose technology primarily because they think it's a disaster for humanity. So they either think it will deprive us of our dignity or humanity, that it will cause more and more severe psychological problems, that it will destroy the planet or the human race. Like, think of existential risk. Lots of people will come at this from an existential risk angle and say that technology is just not worth the risk of destroying everything. The convenience is just not worth the risk of obliterating ourselves and everything else with us. Then I think there's going to be a more conservative wing of the anti-tech movement, which will oppose modern technology for, well, I guess you might say bioconservative reasons. So you'll have lots of opposition to genetic engineering that will be based on a kind of ick factor, an objection to messing with the genes of living things. That's, I guess, sort of analogous to, pro-life sentiments. There will be a kind of neo-vitalism, if you want to put it that way, that objects to any tinkering with the composition of our bodies or the bodies of other things. Then I think there might be a more, I guess if you want to use colors, if we have a blue version in the conservative faction and a green version in the environmental faction, and a kind of colorless version or a gray version in the Kaczynski faction, I think we're going to have a red version as well. You'll have lots of people who will oppose technology because they think it's a force that inherently increases economic inequality. So, you see this now with opposition to Amazon, Google, Facebook, and so on. You'll have a kind of maybe anti-tech socialism, something like that, techno-skeptic socialism. I think that's a predictable direction for this. And then I think you'll have a more anarchist faction of the anti-tech movement that is mostly concerned with the centralization of power in the hands of the state, with the increasing surveillance that technology makes possible. So in short, I think people will come at anti-tech from probably dozens of different angles. Another angle that I didn't mention, but I think is important, is, well, a flat out conspiratorial angle. There will be some people, like the people who've been burning 5G towers. I'm not sure if you've heard of this.
Yeah.
But across Europe, there have been people just catching fire to 5G towers. I'm not sure exactly what the conspiracy is, but there's some belief that these 5G towers are responsible for disease, possibly responsible for COVID.
Yeah, that's what I've been hearing, yeah.
So it's amazing how many of these things have been burned to the ground. It's remarkable, actually. I joked when this started happening that, the Luddites have come back to the Midlands of England.
Yeah.
And I also think there's just going to be a kind of juvenile destructive angle to this too. We know how little reverence the average kid has for machines. Kids, you think of how kids throw snowballs. Well, in my neck of the woods, snowballs, and other people's domain, more like rocks at cars. Kids see something that only adults can use and have a desire to mess with it. And I don't think this goes away with age. You look at how often people mess with self-driving cars. So this has been a real problem in some places where they've tried to test them. People will spray paint them and throw stuff at them and let the air out of the tires, just mess with them. And so I think there's going to be a more impish wing of this too, that doesn't really have an ideology attached to it. But in Ellul's term, it will be more revolt than revolution. So
Interesting, yeah.
In short, I think I don't think the anti-tech movement will be a unified thing. And part of what makes anti-tech, I think, so powerful, so ideologically powerful, and one of the reasons I think that anti-tech will be one of the major political forces in the next century, is precisely this ideological convergence. People will be anti-tech for radically different reasons.
Do you think that I don't know, I would say I agree with you. It seems to be that it's turning into more of like a movement. Maybe it's a consequence of like just the mass amount of people that exists, that like the idea of creating a centralized movement like this seems just kind of practically untenable, at least considering like just the different mindsets that everybody's coming from and the different things that people want to focus on in terms of like what technology is doing. Um, but it also sounds a little bit worrying because I don't know, isn't this kind of one of Kaczynski's big worries about leftists, is that like they'll kind of create these pseudo revolutionary movements that end up taking power away from the people that are actually just focusing on the problem of technology. I guess are you concerned at all about groups that are coming at it from all different angles? Because it's the way that I'm interpreting Kaczynski, he wants all these people to be very focused on just the technological problem. But do you think that there's a way to be focused on the tech problem from multiple angles, or that is the same kind of leftist conspiracy that he's worried about?
I think Kaczynski even underestimates the problem here. So
Hmm.
I think many of these groups will be exclusively focused on the problem of technology,
Mhm.
but they will not agree on what the problem is.
Hmm.
So even if everyone is focused on the problem of technology, that doesn't really demonstrate any fundamental agreement. What is the problem of technology anyway?
Yeah.
Is it that technology dehumanizes us? Is it existential risk? Is it that it will destroy the environment? Is it that it makes us more unequal? What is it? What exactly is the problem of technology in the first place? And I think there will be, well, surprising agreement between some of the factions of the anti-tech movement, despite the fact that they think about the problem differently. I think there will at least be some strategic alliance between them. And even where there's not, they'll tend to push in the same direction.
Right. Kind of like a what's the analogy that I heard? Like a something rolling down a hill, and it's kind of like moving in different directions, but overall it's moving downhill kind of, so it may meander a little bit, but they're unified in this kind of way. I guess another question that we've been liking to ask people, or that we've been wanting to ask people is, I guess your view on whether like no tech or some tech. I guess one of the big divisions that we've kind of noticed within the anti-tech culture, I guess you could call it right now, is there's a lot of people that are advocating for complete elimination and like going all the way back to primitive society, to like hunter-gatherer society, right? And that's where humanity was evolutionarily like fit best, and that was a sustainable type of culture and society, and so that's what we should try to get back to. Maybe it's even wrong to call it a society, but and then there are some people that think that no, we just need to dial it back. We need to get back to like the state of the ancient Greeks, where like they had technology, but in a very limited way. I guess, do you have a vision for how far back we should be going? Or, maybe it's wrong to think about it as going back to, we're going forward, but how do you see a space for technology in the future? I guess is my question. Or
Well,
do you think we should just get rid of it?
I don't have a particular view on this, but I
Okay.
can discuss some of the ones that I think are salient right now.
Yeah.
So on one hand, on one pole, I guess you could say, you have anarcho-primitivists. You have
Mhm.
people like John Zerzan who want to go back to before language.
Right.
They think we made a wrong turn when our relation to the world became mediated through language. What they want is a perfectly authentic relation to the world, which can only be direct and unmediated.
Mhm.
It's only without symbolism, without language. that we can truly relate to the world in an authentic way.
Mhm.
And they think the well, ultimate wrong turn was the agricultural revolution, not the industrial revolution. So it started 10,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution, and when we domesticated animals, we also domesticated ourselves. That's when civilization really began.
Mhm.
So the hunter-gatherer ideal is their ideal. I think it's also, at some level, Kaczynski's ideal. So he thinks that hunter-gatherers' struggle for survival is the perfect fulfillment of the power process. That's what the power process really is. It's the psychology of the hunter-gatherer's struggle for survival translated into the language of modern behavioral or cognitive psychology.
But he also disagrees with the anarcho-primitivists in some key ways, doesn't he?
Oh, certainly, yeah. So he's incredibly critical of anarcho-primitivists. He thinks that they idealize hunter-gatherer societies and project leftist values onto them.
Mm.
So Kaczynski says, look, the idea that people just sat around plucking fruit out of trees and, singing Kumbaya and playing Ring Around the Rosie, and, without any racism or sexism or xenophobia or violence, it's just absurd. Hunter-gatherer societies were sexist, they were racist, they were xenophobic, and they were certainly violent. And living in them was a hell of a lot of hard work.
Mhm.
The idea that people had leisure in these societies is just false.
Mhm.
So he has this essay where it's called The Truth About Primitive Life. And
Mhm.
he doesn't say it, though he does say it in some letters, that it's intended to be a takedown of John Zerzan. It's a takedown of anarcho-primitivism. And so he argues that, well, even if living like a hunter-gatherer is the ideal, they don't know what it was actually like to live like a hunter-gatherer. They've been duped by the leftish anthropologists who portray primitive societies as little gardens of Eden.
Right.
Okay, so then we have Kaczynski, who says, well, the Industrial Revolution was really the wrong turn. There's no way of going back to a society without agriculture. Some small-scale agriculture is pretty much inevitable, and we can't predict what the post-collapse society is going to look like anyway.
Mhm.
So we just have to bring it down and hope for the best.
Mhm.
He doesn't have a particular ideal for what the post-collapse society is going to look like. He doesn't tell us to wind back the clock only so far, or at least so far. He doesn't think we can decide how far back to wind the clock, because one of his, central claims derived from Ellul is that the development of a society can never be subject to rational control. You can't control the development of technology. There's no point. You might be able to help precipitate a collapse, but that is the only way in which we can control it. So the hunter-gatherer ideal is closest to our, genetic heritage, and for that reason, probably the most satisfying, but he thinks any more primitive mode of existence, any mode of existence in which we don't have the exponential growth of technology, is preferable to what we have now.
Mhm.
Then we have David Skrbina,
Mhm.
who says, well, we should roll back technology to, a state where we have some form of high culture. We have a developed intellectual culture and, and sophisticated forms of art and language. So he doesn't want to go back as far as hunter-gatherers or as far back as John Zerzan wants to go.
Mhm.
But he wants to go back far enough so that we're not too close to the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
We're not too close to the takeoff point. We have a bit of a temporal buffer between us and the acceleration that began when we developed machine technology. Now, I don't remember exactly which century he says. Is it the 12th century, maybe?
Yes, I think it was the 12th century.
So that idea is interesting, but it requires us to reject one of Kaczynski's central premises and one of Ellul's, which is that the development of technology can never be subject to rational control.
Mm-hmm.
In order to engage in a deliberate retrenchment or reversal, we have to be able to control technology at some level. Yeah. It has to be possible to guide the system with human intent. And this is precisely what Kaczynski and Ellul deny. So in order to even have this debate about how far back to go, you have to reject a crucial piece of the argument that Ellul sets forth. Now, there's also another position here. The assumption is that people who are critical of technology want to go back. I don't think that's true. And I don't think that's a very helpful way of thinking about it. Why should we talk about going back? It's, well, it assumes
Impossible.
that we can, it assumes that we can go back. And in a literal sense, that's false. But I think in a more fundamental sense, that's also false. You know, the thinker who's helpful here, I think, is Ivan Illich.
Mm-hmm.
So Ivan Illich says, look, I'm not trying to go back. I'm trying to create a more convivial, he says, future. He's trying to create a future where human beings are have a set of technologies that is more suited to their needs and aptitudes. Mm-hmm. So I think a future-oriented way of thinking about it is a lot more helpful. Instead of thinking about how far to go back, think about what the future should look like. Mm-hmm. The danger of this is utopianism. Mm. Now, the thing about the past, to think about thinking in terms of the past, is that it at least does constrain us in a certain way and prevent us from being completely fanciful. So it's true that if a state of affairs has existed, it is at least possible. Mm-hmm. But if we think purely about the future, there's a tendency for us to indulge in grand designs about what the future should be.
And then we're right back in the out of the pot or out of the frying pan into the fire, so to speak.
That's right. It's exactly right. So we have to think about some form of realistic future. And I think that's one of the purposes, one of the fundamental purposes of political theory, to think about some realistic future, not to be hemmed in by our current prejudices.
Right.
But not to indulge in, well, utopian speculation either. We have to be between those two poles.
One like kind of a closing question that I like to ask people is what for someone that is new to these ideas, that maybe just discovered Kaczynski via Netflix documentary or something, and is like looking around for more information, or rather that they see some of the truth in his arguments as we have. Do you have any kind of advice that you would give someone as to like how they can go about either supporting this movement, or just bettering their own life, or trying to better their community? Like, I guess, are there any steps that you've taken in your own life or things that you would recommend for other people to do in order to try to bring about a better future for us?
Well, I'm just going to recommend that anyone who reads Kaczynski and is persuaded by some of the arguments, go and read Ellul. Read Ellul's book, The Technological Society. It's much more demanding than Kaczynski.
Yes.
Well, excellent.
It's a bit thicker, yeah.
So it's what, 450, 460 pages, something like that?
Including the endnotes, yeah. About that. Yeah, about 450.
Okay, well, it's a thick tome for sure. Mm-hmm. But it will give you some insight into where Kaczynski got his ideas, but it will also give you some interesting counterpoints to Kaczynski. Mm-hmm. And lots of people who've read Kaczynski project him back onto Ellul far too much. But if you read him as a different thinker, if you read him as an interlocutor with Kaczynski, I think he's as much an antidote to Kaczynski as he is an influence on him. So I'd recommend that you read them alongside each other. Don't just read everything Kaczynski has written. Branch out, read someone else. Kaczynski is tempting because he's so easy to read.
He is, yeah.
He's incredibly clear. He's incredibly precise and concise. You know, he gives you the analytic philosopher's version of anti-tech. But don't just stop with Kaczynski. And also read some of the stuff that you don't think you'll like. Like, know your enemy is a good motto here. Read the Accelerationist manifesto. Read Ray Kurzweil, the futurist. Read Kevin Kelly. So I think it was John Stuart Mill who said, I'm paraphrasing, he who knows only one side of the argument knows nothing of that, or he who knows only his own side of the argument. So read widely about tech. It's tempting when you find a text that resonates with you to just read everything by that author. But don't read Kaczynski in isolation. Is my best piece of advice.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I like that. And I'll say too, Ellul is not too difficult to read. I mean, Heidegger is much more difficult, I would say, as far as just like understanding what's being said. Ellul is less technical or less analytic than Kaczynski is, so it's a little less straightforward, I guess is fair. But it's by no means, I think, a difficult read. It's inspirational in a lot of ways. I love the fanciful way that he writes sometimes is refreshing. And he has a reverence for humanity too, in the same way that Kaczynski does, I think.
Yeah, and he's a much more complicated thinker, to be sure. He's not someone whose ideas are easily distilled into a doctrine.
No, yeah.
And so I think Ellul helps us guard against the temptation to form a kind of anti-tech doctrine, because he doesn't have one. So I think one of the biggest takeaways from Ellul, which is really helpful as a counterpoint to Kaczynski, is the idea that freedom is essentially resistance against necessity, resistance against power. So in order to be free, there has to be a constraint, and you have to overcome it. And one of the things that Ellul argues is that it's not possible to find freedom in nature, because nature is a set of necessities and determinisms too. Nature is a system that determines our behavior. Now, it does so in a different way than technology does. It's a different set of constraints and determinisms and necessities, but it's a system of constraints, determinisms, and necessities nonetheless. And so what Ellul prods us to do is look at our current circumstance, understand the forces that are acting against us, and resist them and transgress them. And the forces that are acting on us and pushing us change over time. Identifying one force and overcoming it and thinking that you're finally free at last is a mistake. So, Kaczynski's idea of the power process to Ellul is absurd. You're not going to find freedom by obeying human nature. To Ellul, Kaczynski's power process is nothing but enslavement to human nature. If you're obeying the power process, well, you are subject to the power of nature, subject completely to the forces of nature. Now, it might be preferable to being subject to the much more powerful forces of technology, but it's certainly not freedom in any fundamental sense. So this is why I'd recommend that you read Ellul. Ellul gives you, I think, a much more powerful conception of freedom. And that idea of freedom as transgressing or resisting necessity, I think is the idea that I think might help you live your life in a different way. So every time you feel the pull of your phone or feel the urge to check your email, and you say no, you recognize that you have this compulsion. You recognize that the phone is pulling you, or that the email is pulling you, and you deliberately resist and keep reading your book. That is freedom. That is what freedom from technology really looks like. It's, well, willpower is a crude way of putting it, but deliberate resistance. First, the recognition that you're determined, and second, the refusal to obey.
Just
That's
say
the
no.
that's the idea of freedom that Ellul gives you, that you will not find in Kaczynski.
Interesting. And I want to ask you too, because I know you've read a lot of Ellul, and most people that are talking about these ideas are most familiar with the Technological Society. Is there a number 2 book that you would recommend for people to that they want to, if they want to dig into Ellul a little bit more past the Tech Society?
Well, there's a broad tie for number 2. It's pretty hard to pick a number 2. The one that people typically read second is called Propaganda. So in the Technological Society, Ellul gives you a comprehensive overview of the technical phenomenon, as he calls it. The society that is structured according to technique, that is organized around the idea that everything must be rational and efficient. And then in Propaganda, he gives you an account of one particularly important technique in our society, which is propaganda. So the function of propaganda is to give people a psychological palliative that allows them to live in the society that we've created. It's a set of psychological techniques that allows us to cope with the stress and anxiety and depression and pressure that we're put under by the Technological Society. So propaganda is the usual number 2. The more difficult, but I think work that's tied for number 2 is Ellul's book, Autopsy of Revolution. And I've discussed that a bit, so don't really need to rehash it. And there, Ellul gives you a critique of the contemporary idea of revolution. He says, the French Revolution can't be our model, and then he sketches out at the end what an alternative idea of revolution would look like. Then he has a couple of other books about technology that are worth reading. So he wrote a book that's a follow-up to the Technological Society. It's published, I think, in 1977, called The Technological System. And there he's trying to update the Technological Society to take into account the more recent developments in technology. And he's especially thinking of computers and networks. And later on in 1988, he published his last book about technology, which is called The Technological Bluff. And in that book, he's analyzing not technique or techniques, but technology proper, meaning the discourse of technique. So he's analyzing the words and phrases and modes of thought that make up the Technological Society. So he's analyzing the technological mindset, in other words. And that's his last word on technology. So that's well worth a read and gives you his, well, reflections on what he had written before, as well as some new thoughts about technology.
Gotcha.
Now, if you want to start at the other end and you want a kind of overview of Ellul's thought that gives you both the theology and the critique of technology, I'd suggest starting with, well, I guess it was his first book on the subject, at least. I think it was published in 1948, and it's translated in 2 different ways. One is Presence in the Modern World, and the other is The Presence of the Kingdom. So look up either of those titles and you'll find it. And there you get, in a very short book, almost a total overview of everything Ellul wrote after that. You get encapsulated in one book most of the, or at least in some form, most of the points that Ellul went on to develop. in his later books. So you get his Christian theology, and you get the idea that our society is fundamentally one in which means are privileged over ends. So that gives you, I think, a pretty big overview of Ellul's thought. The thing to keep in mind with Ellul is in every book except The Presence of the Kingdom, you're dealing with one side of a dialectic. So when you read the Technological Society by itself, you get this, well, seemingly pessimistic, fatalistic view that we are determined on all sides by technology and there's no way out. It's the kind of book that by itself would drive you to despair.
Mm-hmm.
And unless you read the other side, and unless you read Ellul's Ethics, like one of his books is The Ethics of Freedom, unless you read the theological part and you accept it, which is quite a demand, you're only getting one side of the argument. So Presence in the Modern World, or The Presence of the Kingdom, is really the only book that gives you both sides of Ellul's thought.
Okay.
So that, in a nutshell, is what people should read. I would suggest that after the Technological Society, you look at the Technological Bluff.
Okay, for sure. Tech Society, then Tech Bluff.
Yep.
And then we also got Presence of the Modern World or Presence of the Kingdom. Awesome. Cool. Thank you for that, Sean. But yeah, is there anything else I think we're gonna sign off in a minute here. Is there anything lastly that you wanted to mention, or that you feel you didn't get to explain enough, or something that you're working on that maybe you want to talk about? I don't know. Anything? Just kind of a free form. If not, it's totally cool too.
Well, I will eventually, hopefully in the not too distant future, have a book about anti-tech ideas that centers on Ellul and Kaczynski.
Okay.
So stay tuned for that. The article is one part of a larger project, and there will be a book hopefully in the not too distant future.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. Once again, your article is The Unabomber and the Origins of Anti-Tech Radicalism, published in the Journal of Political Ideologies, and I'll put a link to it in the description to this video, and recommend everyone go read it and check it out and cite it and start writing your own stuff, and let's get this discussion going and the movement moving further along. But yeah, Sean, thank you again for agreeing to come on and talk with us and talk about these connections with Kaczynski and Ellul, and where a lot of these ideas come from, and the kind of the intellectual history and development of these ideas. I think it's really refreshing to talk about and hear about other thinkers besides Kaczynski, because he's such a huge name right now, and he's, you know, the one that most people are aware of, but not a lot of people know where he got his ideas from, or even know that he wasn't the originator of a lot of his ideas, and that there's a whole slew of literature and things to look at and study out there. So thank you again for coming on, Sean, and talking with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun, and
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone for listening as well.
Yes, thank you for listening, everyone, and yeah, we'll catch you soon, we hope. Hey guys, so after the interview, Sean and I kept talking for a little while, and the following is that conversation, so enjoy. Yeah, it is.
And your first question, why are we so afraid of the Unabomber? I don't know. I really don't know.
Maybe it's just too recent. I don't, it's too real, because like, I don't know.
Not too recent though. You know, it's been over a quarter of a century. Let's put this in perspective.
That is weird to think about. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago, but a lot has happened since then, right?
The man has been in prison. He's no threat to anyone. You know, he is an old mathematician sitting in a prison cell writing books.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't see why it's easy to publish an analysis of, say, you know, some far right thinker. You know, you can easily publish an article on Carl Schmitt. Are you familiar with him?
I'm not.
The Nazi legal theorist.
Oh, okay, yeah.
He's a darling of political theorists now, and some philosophers are also fans of his. But he was, after Heidegger, the most famous German intellectual who was a member of the Nazi Party.
Mm-hmm.
He's a staunch critic of liberalism. He's decidedly a figure of the right, said lots of anti-Semitic things. He's a contemporary boogeyman, if anyone is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's easy to publish about him.
Yeah.
Lots of figures on the left have taken up some of his ideas, co-opted them, used them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand why Heidegger is not beyond the pale, and Schmidt is not beyond the pale, and Antonio Negri is not beyond the pale. All of them, on the contrary, are, well, thinkers that you can discuss in polite society
Mm-hmm.
and intellectual establishments. But Kaczynski will hinder your career if you dare to talk about him.
I wonder,
actually pretty strange, actually.
Do you think it might be partially due to the fact that he's like an individual advocating these ideas, that he's not part of like some grand group? So like, I don't know, maybe people are more comfortable talking about like Carl Schmitt because they can attribute some of his ideas to like the Nazi Party as a whole, that like I don't know, that they can somehow separate the individual from like the group that they were a part of. But Kaczynski's, it's just all him. So I don't know. Do you think there might be something with that, or I'm just kind of speculating right now?
I think that's an interesting hypothesis, but I think what cuts in the other direction is the fact that he is so often lumped into some group or another. People don't think about him as an individual for the most part. They think of him as a radical environmentalist or a neo-Luddite or an anarchist. They stick a label on him. Mm-hmm. They try to make sense of him by slapping some inapt label on him.
Mm-hmm. Which is a technical move in itself, right? That us,
of course,
we're afraid of engaging.
Yeah. It's a way to pigeonhole him and to avoid having to deal with him. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of what else could be it. I think, well, at least some of it is the widespread perception that he's insane.
Yeah, that's probably part of it. And that, yeah, then like these Netflix documentaries and stuff aren't helping either, when they focus so much on like the MK Ultra experiment and like, oh, we never got laid in college, and like attributing.
Yeah, of course, they try to explain him away. Mm-hmm. And it worked on me in the beginning, and I thought, well, this guy is a crazed conspiracy theorist, a kind of Charles Manson. Mm-hmm. I bought that narrative. But one only has to read the manifesto to dispel that, one would have thought.
Yeah, that's really it, right? Like I reading his words makes it apparent how like not insane he was. I don't know. I for me, when I first read the manifesto, it was like I don't know, just like stumbling upon some answer that I didn't even know I had a question about, kind of like all the things that he talked about, right? Like all these things that he was talking about, like with the power process and engaging in surrogate activities, I was like, that is why I feel this way about the world that we're living in right now. He was like, he hit the nail on the head for me. And so I was like, oh, like he's right. And then you hear the whole story of like, oh, he like evaded the FBI for 17 years living in a cabin in Montana. And I'm like, crazy people can't do that. Like, I don't know.
That's right. And Michael Mello, I mentioned him earlier, the law professor. Mm-hmm. He exchanged about 150 letters with Kaczynski and had dozens of phone calls with him, and said, look, the only way that you could portray this guy as insane is if sending bombs to people in the mail and living in a cabin and hating technology add up to mental illness. Mm-hmm. So if those things, by definition, imply mental illness, then he's mentally ill. But Mello says, that's just so far from the truth. That is just a smokescreen. Mello says, he's not a mad bomber. He's a chillingly sane bomber. Mm-hmm. And from the perspective of even from the perspective of the people he bombed, I think it does a disservice to them to say that he's insane. If he's insane, it mitigates his responsibility.
Mhm.
It's not just a disservice to his ideas, it's a disservice to the people he killed and injured. This is my response to the people who portray him as insane.
Mhm.
This was a completely cynical, dishonest attempt to mitigate his responsibility for his crimes. So, when someone accuses you of being an apologist for saying Kaczynski isn't insane, you have an easy retort. Well, you are letting him off the hook for his crimes by saying he's insane.
Yeah. Taking the easy way out.
That's right.
I was gonna say too that what was I gonna say? That oh yeah, I've even we've toyed with the idea of like printing out copies of his manifesto and just like taking his name out or putting it at the very end or something like that and saying by the way, this was written by Theodore. Like, I wonder if people would be more reticent to the ideas if they didn't know who wrote them. Because I mean, especially like in our generation, I don't know, like I wasn't I wasn't an avid reader when the manifesto came out, if I was even alive. So like some of people that like are my friends from like high school and stuff, and that see that I'm working on this project, and they're like, oh, like you talk about like Kaczynski, didn't he like kill a bunch of people? I'm like, yeah, did you read what he wrote? And they're like, no. And I'm like, oh, then you probably should, and then you might have a different opinion. I don't know, people are so ready to buy that story because it allows them to continue living their lives without having to question it. It's probably, it's a hard thing to swallow when you're so invested in the technological society. You don't want to hear criticism about it, right? Like that forces you
of course.
to.
The fact that he used violence provides an easy reason to dismiss him.
Mm-hmm.
It's an easy out for those who don't want to engage with him. But at the same time, Ellul is, well, even easier to dismiss, precisely because he doesn't have the notoriety. So on one hand, here's what Kaczynski would say. He'd say, well, the reason that you've read this at all, the reason that anyone has read this is precisely that I've used violence. Mm-hmm. Who the hell has heard of Jacques Ellul?
Yeah.
People who listen to this podcast. Mm-hmm. A few philosophers of technology, a few sociologists, and a few theologians. Mm-hmm. But one thing Jacoby says in this essay of his in Dark Mountain, he says, people hate Kaczynski because he won. And I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
He kind of did one up the system.
He kind of did. He he got away from the FBI for 17 years. I guess would this be considered the like only time that the United States government has given into the demands of a terrorist? Or
probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it is. And it's certainly the only time that newspapers have been blackmailed into publishing a short book.
Completely unedited, just like, yeah.
Yeah, well, the joke is that, he submitted this manuscript. What I've written in a piece that's coming up soon. So first he broke the rule against submitting the same manuscript in multiple journals simultaneously. to Penthouse, to the Washington Post, the New York Times, a couple others. And then, well, this was, as one sociologist said, he says, this is the most reviewed academic manuscript in history. Mm-hmm. Think about all the academics that the FBI sent it to before it was published.
Yeah.
Had more reviewers than any journal article in history. And he didn't even get a revise and resubmit.
No. That's great. It's the most successful, successful publication that we've ever had.
So that is one of the most remarkable parts of the story. But there is another piece to all this that it's often neglected when people talk about the manifesto and the demand for publication. one of the things that was in there, one of the things he demanded in exchange for ceasing his bombing campaign was actually the right to publish follow-ups. So and they agreed to publish short follow-ups after the publication of the manifesto. And I actually found his notes for a follow-up essay.
Oh.
So he had a skeleton structure of a follow-up essay, which is another one of the pieces of gold that's in that archive.
Oh, okay. It's called gold,
So,
you said? Or one of the nuggets of gold, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. It's just notes for a follow-up essay.
Okay.
And one of the things in there, one of the things he planned to elaborate on, there's a tiny bit in one of my footnotes about this. So he planned to have a section on natural selection and how evolution drives the development of technology. So there was a lot more to be written about the evolutionary underpinnings of his view of technology.
Yeah, that is something that I don't know, like I haven't dug into too deeply, but something that like sticks in my brain is like I don't know, I guess a lot of pro-tech people have this attitude that we are kind of like, no, I guess it's one of two things. I guess there are some people that think that we're kind of using technology to overcome evolution, right? That we're kind of like engaging in this rational control of how we develop, but it's not actually, we're not the ones controlling it. But then I think there's some people that say that, you know, we are, again, have this like natural tendency to create technology, that like making tools is something innate to humanity, and that like for it to expand to this point is like a success for evolution for them. Yeah.
Think about it this way. The obvious retort to the second point is that, okay, well, maybe we do have an innate tendency or drive to create and use tools. But at a certain point, technology ceases to be merely a collection of tools and machines.
Yeah.
It becomes a system, like an ecosystem or an organism in its own right, that rapidly evolves. Yeah. And of course, you know, a tumor is built from our own cells. A tumor is in some sense part of us as well.
Yeah, technology is in some sense natural, right? In the same kind of way.
That's right. A tumor is natural, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's at least natural once removed, as technology is.
This is made out of paper, if you want to call a book technology. This is made out of natural resources, right? At some point.
Of course, and you know, there's Skrbina emphasizes this constantly. He says there's no deep ontological distinction between technology and nature.
Yeah.
That binary doesn't really work. You know, technology is in some sense natural, but again, a tumor is natural. So from the perspective of a biological human being, this form of rapid technological evolution is malignant and threatening. So just as the tumor kills its host, well, you know, the technological system is a rapidly growing tumor on our human society.
It's a cancerous entity. I think one of the hardest questions, though, is figuring out when it stops being, you know, like a tool for human means, and when it turns into a system. It seems like really hard to define where that point is. And I guess this is why some of like the anarcho-primitivist sentiments kind of make sense to me, in that like anyone else that's drawing a line, it seems like it's really hard to defend that line. And so if you just like say, oh, nope, we're just getting rid of all of it, just like, you know, level the ground, so to speak, that at least, I don't know, it at least requires a less rigorous argument, it seems.
Yeah, it eliminates the need to draw some arbitrary distinction. It's very difficult to identify the point at which technology took off and became autonomous. Yeah. And Kaczynski says this somewhere, I think it's in the manifesto. It says, at some point, Europe became dynamic. And we don't really know why. There's no particular reason for it. It's not clear when it became an autonomous system. The fact is that it is now.
Yeah.
That's undeniable. When it happened is a difficult question. And it's difficult, not least because the people at the time would not have recognized it because it was a gradual process.
Right.
And we don't have access to the information necessary to determine when it became autonomous looking back. Now, Ellul, I think, believes that technology is always, in some sense, autonomous. That even the simple tool is a means that easily becomes an end in itself. So fine, a stone axe is something for cutting down a tree. But when you make it your life's work to develop a better and better axe, well, who's really in control there? When an arms race takes off, one tribe develops a better axe, and then the other has to develop a better axe to keep up. Who's really in control? Competition drives a kind of arms race in which each side has to develop better and better means. So in that case, the means do become ends. They overshadow all the ends. The fundamental question for Ellul is, when do the means start to become ends in themselves? That is really the question. It's not a specific point of autonomy, but a question of the relative balance between means and ends.
Yeah.
But on that note, I should get going and have some supper here.
For sure. Yeah, it's same. I got to get some food too.
But this has been great. So thanks again for having me. This has been really enjoyed this, and hopefully we could do this again at some point in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming on.
Cheers, Griffin. Have a good weekend.
Cheers, you too. Bye.